The reading that we have set for today comes from Matthew chapter 18. It's quite a well-known passage. It's the parable of the ungrateful servant. Remember the servant who was called by his master because he owed him a lot of money. The master was busy trying to settle up debts, and then the servant couldn't pay back this huge debt that he owed, and so begged for forgiveness and mercy. And the landowner or the master had mercy on him and cleared his debt. And as he walks out of the room, the servant finds another servant who owes him a couple of bucks and says, "Come, pay back, I want my money now." And the other guy can't pay him. And so he has him whipped and flogged and kicked out. And it's a really powerful parable about just kind of how we take what we can get and then pass it on to the next person. So the main character received this forgiveness from his master, but was not willing to pass it on to the next person. So of course we know the master calls him back in and reprimands him and then casts him into prison for not having paid his debt. Now, quite often it's useful to really sort of focus in on a single verse. And the verse that really struck me today from this passage is when Peter says, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus answers, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Or we could also translate it as 70 times 7 times. Whatever it is, a lot of times that we're supposed to forgive our neighbor. And so that verse really struck me. And sometimes it's really helpful to kind of zoom in on a single verse and really dig into it. And other times it's quite useful to sort of look at the whole picture of what's going on around that verse and get the big picture and the context. And that's what I'd like to do today. Chapter 18 is really a lovely chapter of Matthew because it provides a series of parables and teachings from Jesus about the life of the church. And in the first several verses, he really speaks about the little ones. He speaks about the children. The disciples are wanting to chase children away, and Jesus is saying that the smallest person here on earth is the greatest person in heaven. And then he has a passage about not causing our brother or sister to stumble, and of really being considerate for other people and their vulnerabilities, and not doing things that would cause them to stumble. Stumbling could be to sin, but it could also be to stumble in their faith, that they might lose their sense of confidence or faith in God. And so it's about us being considerate of other people and where they are in their faith journey and in their life, and not just being too self-centered, I guess, and a bit gung-ho. Then the third section is the parable of the wandering sheep. And this is a parable that speaks about Jesus' commitment to those little ones. So he speaks about a shepherd who has 100 sheep, and one of the sheep goes missing. So ordinarily, we in our modern society might think, well, he's still got the 99, and the 99 are more important than the one. But in this story, the shepherd leaves the 99 to go after the one, because the one is as important as the 99. And so it's a beautiful parable about love seeking out people, that love seeks out and is in some ways willing to leave the big group in order to find the one. It speaks about the importance of one, the importance of the individual, that you are important, that I am important, that another individual, even a person that we might not like or might think is not particularly important, that one person is important. In a sense, the message of that parable, the parable of the wandering sheep from verses 10 to 14 in Matthew 18, is a message that love is always seeking out. God is always seeking out those who are lost. Then in the next section, which is verses 15 to 20, we get a narrative about dealing with sin in the church. And so Jesus begins to talk about what do you do when your brother or your sister sins. And he presents a very nuanced approach to engaging in the sin of somebody else in our community. He says, first of all, you just go on your own. You just go one-on-one and you just have a talk with that person and see whether they'll listen. And if they refuse to listen, you'd go back to them again, but this time with one or maybe two other people. Again, just a very small group of people, maybe just you and one other. You go back and you just talk again. And if that still doesn't work, you go back again. And at some point, you'll invite the church to participate. And ultimately, Jesus says, if they refuse to listen, then treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. And I must say, every time I've read that passage, I've always thought, well, what does that mean? Oh, they must be cast out and they must be excommunicated and church discipline and la la la. When you think about Jesus and tax collectors, I immediately think of Zacchaeus. And Jesus in no way cast Zacchaeus out. In fact, he invited himself to Zacchaeus' house. I'm not aware of any stories in the Bible that explicitly speak about pagans, but there are stories about people who are not Jewish and not followers of Christ. And so we think about the centurion whose daughter was gravely ill and died. And Jesus goes to his house in order to bring her back to life and to restore her to health. So how did Jesus treat pagans and tax collectors? He went to go visit them. I think sometimes we just make the assumption Jesus means excommunication. But actually, what Jesus does with pagans and tax collectors, how does he treat them? He engages with them. He goes to visit them in their homes. So here's a passage about how love challenges, that God challenges us. Sin is not okay. And when a friend of ours, a brother or sister of ours in our church is sinning, it is our responsibility to go and speak to them and say, hey, this is not cool. This is not okay. And if they refuse to listen, to persist, to challenge, to confront, that's part of what love does. Love doesn't let sin just go unspoken. But the passage seems to culminate with a moving towards rather than a casting out. I thought that was really interesting. And then we get to the third parable, which is the parable of the ungrateful servant. And here the focus of the parable seems to be about forgiveness. Jesus explains to Peter that you don't just need to forgive once or twice, you need to forgive effectively an infinite number of times. You need to be repeatedly forgiving. 7 times 70. That's a lot of forgiving of one person for one thing. Here we have a story about love forgiving. Love being willing to let go. Love being willing to move on. And perhaps even love being willing to reconcile. The only difference is that forgiveness is something that we can do, but reconciliation requires the other person to also want to reconcile with us. So forgiveness is something you can do on your own. Reconciliation with that person that you've forgiven is something that requires them to reciprocate something. So there's a two-way there. But the message is that love always forgives. And actually, right at the end of this passage, there's quite a striking verse, because the story itself, the parable itself, is quite striking. The master, when he hears that the servant has not forgiven the debt of another person, calls him back in verse 32, and he says, "You wicked servant, I cancelled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" In his anger, the master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. The imperative to forgive is very strong in the story. The master forgives the servant, and the servant is then expected to forgive other people. When he doesn't, the master holds him to account. And so in the final verse, Jesus says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you, unless you forgive your brother or your sister from your heart." It reads a bit like a threat, doesn't it? That being cast into outer darkness, if we do not forgive, we will be punished. It does read a bit like a threat. And actually there's some Bible commentators who think that that verse was not there in the original because it seems to be out of kilter with the rest of the passage. But another one of my commentators translates this verse in a way that I find really helpful. He writes it like this: "Thus also my heavenly Father will do to every single one of you who does not forgive your brother or your sister, and forgive them from the bottom of your heart. Thus also my heavenly Father will do to every single one of you who does not forgive your brother or your sister, and forgive them from the bottom of your heart." I think Jesus is perhaps using a hyperbole here. In other words, he is exaggerating because he wants us to understand how important forgiveness is. He's saying it is so important that we forgive. And he gives us a model. God has forgiven us completely and utterly for absolutely everything. How can we then not forgive somebody else who's done something against us? There's a pattern of replication that we need to follow. And Jesus has a very high expectation that we do this. Matthew chapter 18 speaks about church and church relationships, relationships amongst Christians, not necessarily relationships at home and not necessarily relationships out in the broader community. Most of the passage seems to be speaking about relationships between believers. And in this passage, he speaks about love seeking out, particularly seeking out what Jesus refers to repeatedly in this chapter as the little ones and the one. It is a story about love challenging, not allowing sin to go unspoken, unquestioned, unconfronted. That love pushes and demands and expects that we behave in ways that are aligned with the values of Christ. And thirdly, that love forgives and forgives and forgives. And the ending of the chapter conveys to us the message that the most important of these is forgiveness. To forgive our sisters and brothers who have done something against us. May God give us the courage and the wisdom to be able to live out his word in these ways, to be able to seek and to challenge and to forgive. Amen.